All right, I am going to introduce our moderator here for this evening, Ibarionex Perello, known for many, many years. Big supporter of our organization. He serves on our board of advisors, terrific educator. He's teaching here for so many years. He's also the host of the Candid Frame Photography podcast. Just to reel off some of his credits, his role and his host as producer of the Candid Frame. He provides frank, insightful interviews with some of the industry's top established and emerging photographers. The show has featured guests such as Jay Mizell, Joe Meyerowitz, Pete Turner, Lynn Goldsmith, and Garrett Ludwig, just to name a few. The program is consistently ranked among the top programs of all its type. Incredible resource. If you have not seen that, I highly encourage you to check out the Candid Frame. Ibarionex is also a prolific writer. He's produced and come out with many books: Chasing the Light, Improving Your Photography Using Available Light, 5D Mark III, From Snapshot to Great Shots in Adobe Masterclass Photoshop, and his latest book, Making Photographs, Developing a Personal Visual Workflow. Very, very busy man, very talented. Gives me great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening, Mr. Perello. Take it away, sir.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon, Kevin, and everybody at LACP for putting this together. It's always one of the best weeks that LACP has to offer. And that's not just because I love street photography myself, but the amazing amount of talent that they're able to bring together is always amazing. And tonight is no exception. Tonight's photographers, Michelle Groskopf, Don Hudson, and Janet Delaney, are very different photographers. But I think they're three wonderful photographers to bring together in a single night, because they each take street photography and they personalize it. They make it their own. I think when a lot of people want to have a general interest in street photography, they go to Flickr or Instagram, and there's a sort of a uniformity in terms of the kinds of images that are out there. And very quickly you get kind of bored. There's only so many high contrast images with someone in silhouette and, a person walking down the street. And after a while you think, is that it? But the best photographers realize that street photography is not just about certain visual archetypes. It's really a way of seeing. And each of these photographers not only demonstrate, incredible sense of like composition and light, but they're really chroniclers of a community and a time. And I really want you to take a look at their images, both that they'll be sharing and then visiting their website, because you'll see that the street photography sensibility is what you're going to be seeing in their work. And hopefully it will expand your idea and your concept of what street photography is at when it can be, because there is no singular approach to this. And the only challenge that you have as a photographer is finding out how you need to approach it. So you'll learn some technical things tonight, no doubt, but more importantly, I hope that you'll be inspired to realize that the unique way that you see the world, the way you experience it, is your most valuable asset as a photographer. It has nothing to do with the camera that you're using or the software that you're using. It's all about what's coming from in here and in here. And these three photographers certainly embody that. And we're going to start off with one of my favorites, my friend, Michelle Groskopf. And take it, Michelle.
I feel like you just said everything that I was going to say. Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. And I see lots of familiar faces. And I'm happy to be here. When I talk about my work personally and street photography as a way of interacting in the public sphere, I always talk about one thing, and it's going to be the same thing tonight, which is near and dear to my heart, which is that the street is, for me, the Wild West, and pretty much anything you want it to be. There are no rules. I'm not here to list off a bunch of characteristics that your photos need to have, nor am I going to tell you that they need to be candid or otherwise, that you need to hide in the shadows, that you need to use a zoom lens or any sort of camera. I'm here to tell you that walking around and engaging in public life is one of the best ways I could possibly think of to get to know yourself and to connect with the culture around you and sort of interpret it through your particular life. So I'm going to share it with you what I do, which is not always sort of what other people do. So excuse me as I share a screen here. Okay, so basically how I've always sort of done it is I walk around by myself traditionally, and I kind of look around at what's passing me by, and I tend to get exceptionally excited about the details and the faces and the smaller things that make up my view as I wander down the street, the things that turn my head or that just in general like draw my attention. Generally, I run up like a maniac and I take those photos. Let me see. So I spend a lot of time wandering around LA, and the sun here is amazing. And I use a flash as well. And I personally am very considered and concerned about how I can really drag anybody who's ever looking at any of my photos to the exact thing that I'm looking at. And so I hope I'm taking all of your hands and I'm dragging you through the streets of LA and I'm showing you, for example, this face or that snake wrapped around that woman and this pregnant belly. And I use flash, which I'll talk about in a second, why I love it so much. I do a lot of details and hands and faces. And sometimes people know that I'm talking to them, that I'm shooting them and I talk to them. And sometimes they have no idea. Sometimes they have an idea and I get it. And then I just like sort of disappear. But what I'm most interested in is building an energy or slowing down an energy in this case, for example. And just sort of putting a frame around the things that I find to be really interesting on the street as I wander through my day. My hope is in general that like, and for all photographers here, that one day we'll look back at these photos and kind of get a glimpse at like modern culture, youth culture, the things that we were wearing, the technology that we were using, the faces, like how we interacted with each other, etc. But for the most part, I'm quite isolating as a photographer, as you see. I like to separate and really hone in my my framing to be exactly what I want it to be. And I find that like the more you train yourself to look, the more you start to see in this particular way. And all the little things that people take for granted generally, I tend to see like I have a very heavy eagle eye. So like this, for example, just walking by and this woman, I love this, was shoving a cigarette into, I guess, a makeshift ashtray of some sort on up here. There's so many nice things about this. I think by allowing myself to be free on the street and not to follow any sort of rules or expectations of like what people expect a street photographer to be like, then I can really, really, really play with what I'm telling you and the framing and get really intimate. And I'm just love getting really close and catching things, you know. So I'm gonna shut up for a second and just kind of show you a few more because I brought a lot. Oh yeah, I'll jump back to Flash for a second. Flash is really important to me for obvious reasons, I think, looking at these photos, but like they make the colors pop, and color is very important to me. Color is a big part of the story. It's the reason why I probably looked at this person. They're all in red. And Flash helps almost make big the little things, or make serious the things that we find inconsequential, like this pizza, this guy. It just makes everything look a little bit more playful, and really lets the audience know that I'm there and I'm present and I'm never hidden and I'm always part of the photo. And generally these people see me, whether they choose to acknowledge me or not, because I have a flash in my hand. And sometimes I'm really lucky and a conversation ensues. Sometimes people get angry. Sometimes you know, we have this moment that we share together, but it's just like this, and it's either good or bad, and that's it. Yeah, and I think Flash allows me to, like in this kind of composition, I find that I love tonalities and tones and monochromes and whatnot, and so there's something in my gut that tells me this is working, this works, from having done it so often. And I'm not really thinking at that point, and then I come home and I see like, wow, everything is so blended so beautifully, and the shadow's beautiful and tells a strong story. I also feel like I leave storytelling to other people, grand storytelling or gestures as story or moments as story, and instead I explore faces as story, or details, body parts, the way we carry ourselves. That's more the story that I'm interested in. What sort of stories our bodies are telling, what culturally we're giving. Like this I took the other day is insane. Sorry. It makes me laugh. I want to see it so big. This kind of stuff, like I'm kind of building this archive of almost like everyday teenagers. They don't even, it doesn't matter who she is. It's just like signifiers, the Arizona tea, the midriff, the phone, the mask, all the little things I tell you teenager, and will tell you 50 years from now that this was a teenager at this time. It's very interesting to me. Bodies are interesting. And as you can see, I tend to wander around the whole of the city. I love the beach. I love the suburbs, the valley. I love, you know, Hollywood, where I sort of live. And yeah, I'll go anywhere where I can find people, really. And sometimes people really give it up. I think that's the greatest thing, that if you are open to what the street has to offer when you head out, it will give back to you every time. And so like this girl playing off of me. I am also an editorial and commercial photographer. That's how I make a living. And I shoot for various publications, including the New York Times and different magazines and brands and stuff. And the reason why they choose me, I think, often is because I am so practiced with everyday people and putting people at ease. And I've kind of like figured out a way to interact with the public with my camera that brings out the best of both of us. And so I bring that to my work. And then lately, I think my work has been bringing a lot to my street photography and how I see.
As long as I've known you, your work is like, it's you.
Oh,
right?
yeah, thanks.
And one of the challenges that a lot of photographers experience is they talk about trying to find a style.
Oh,
but,
yeah.
But the other thing is feeling comfortable with the way that you shoot.
Mm-hmm.
I think that you find a way that works for you. You know, what did it take for you to feel comfortable and fully embrace the way that you approach it?
Yeah, like years and years and years of just doing it on the street without showing anybody any of it. Really, I think that's it. Not looking, I come from a film background, so I didn't know anything about photographers or photography or street photography or anything. I just knew like this is a pretty well-known story now, but when I moved to LA from New York, and I had been a film professor at School of Visual Arts in New York, and I was a working producer and telling stories, and that kind of was my goal for a living. And I got to LA, and then like turns out everybody was a producer, and like my dreams surely and very quickly got shattered. I got very poor. I wasn't making anything, got very depressed. I was couch surfing. I was like almost pretty destitute. And I had a camera, and so like I just went out on the street and started taking photos. Like I never in a million years thought I would be here today shooting for people for a living ever. It's a miracle. And what saved me was street photography, of just literally like making a meditation for myself daily, of going out, getting to know LA and taking photos of the people that I saw. And somehow, like, even though I was so lonely, I didn't know anybody here, I was so poor, just like connecting with people through my camera. And so like that style that you see, I think now it's pretty played out. I'm getting kind of upset about it. I'm not gonna lie to you, like so many rip-offs. But I feel like it's so me because it's literally exactly how I see. It's like was just me walking around looking at stuff. It's not anything else. Anybody is always welcome to come out with me. I go for photo walks with people here and there, and like it's just literally me running around like a crazy person looking at things that excite me. Like, whoa, look at those pants, look at that person's face, look at those people cuddling, look at what's happening over there. And I just run and I take photos, and it's very exciting, and I'm very energetic and crazy, and it's just so me at this point. It's like I'm not even thinking, and it just comes from like experimentation and doing. And I knew that there was something, a quality that I liked about the flash. I knew that I wanted to get close. It's like a natural instinct for me. So I just followed those instincts. I just followed my gut and just made it. So I never told myself no. And that's why I hate rules. I hope everybody here just throws all those rules out the window, and you can do whatever you want. You can call whatever you want street, like who cares? Just make good work. That's the only rules. Like say something original, say something that's true to your heart. Say something, anything, add to the voices. Don't, with positivity and energy, don't just throw work out there. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much. All right, Don. It's all yours now.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you for that introduction. And thank you to the LA Center of Photography for inviting me. Thank you to all of you for coming. What I want to talk about tonight is, first of all, I've never given one of these talks before, so this is new for me. But what I'd like to talk about is my own evolution of my relationship to photography, the game of photography over the years. And I like to call myself a proud amateur. And by that, I mean, I've never made my living at photography. In fact, I decided that about 50 years ago that I wasn't going to do that. And I've never taught photography, and it's strictly been personal for all these years. And even before that, I mean, I got my first camera probably 65 years ago. And so I was born in 1950 in Detroit, Michigan, and which at the time was the fourth largest city in the United States, and it had almost 2 million people at the peak of its population. And, you know, I'm not sure, I think they may have 700,000 now. So growing up in the 1950s, my first relationship with photography was as a subject. You know, I was a kid, you know, at the holidays, the birthday parties, the vacations, the camera would come out, and we as subjects had a place to be and where to stand and so forth. And the person with the camera had a responsibility. And I think something even then lodged in my subconscious that there's a power with in that camera. And because things changed whenever it came out. And I think I just picked up on that, I guess. Anyways, when I hit my tweens in the early 60s, I acquired my first camera, a Kodak Instamatic. And I wanted to be that person on the family vacations that documented the family and what was going on. And I still even have to this day photographs from a trip we took to Florida to see Cape Canaveral. And they're not very good, they're boring, but it's so cool that I have them. And I think this whole idea of building an archive is fascinating to me. Anyway, so when I hit high school in the late 60s, I befriended two guys who were the yearbook photographers. And the cool thing about them is that they both had dark rooms in their parents' basement, which was, and one of them especially was a scene of a lot of camaraderie, smoking dope, and things, listening to music, and we had the water running and everything to hide our. Anyways, that encouraged me to build my first dark room, and thankfully my sweet mother allowed me to build it in her laundry room. It was she allowed me to black out the window, and I put a board across the washer and dryer and had the laundry shop there. So I was, it was a setup, knockdown affair. But at that time, like a lot of people that initially discovered the darkroom, I was into processes back then, more so than the image. I mean, the image really didn't matter to me that much. I was doing things like blowing up small sections of the negative. The movie Blow Up was a big influence on people of my generation back then. And things like solarization, working with different kind of film developers, doing all kinds of crazy stuff in the darkroom, even including taking a match to my transparencies to see how they would turn out. When I graduated in 1969, the war in Vietnam was still raging quite a bit. And one way to avoid the draft was to go to university. So, like a dutifully middle-class kid, I went off to university, didn't know what I wanted to do. Of course, soon after I entered the university, they instituted the lottery draft. So I drew a very low number, which was likely that I was going to get drafted. And sure enough, about a year or so later, I did get called up for my pre-induction physical and went down for it. And I had a hernia and they rejected me. And that was probably the first real profound event, I think, that affected my relationship to photography, believe it or not. Because at the time I was pretty much just drifting in college, didn't know what I wanted to do, and skipped probably most of my classes. But the thought of, what possibly could happen to my life if I was drafted and sent to Vietnam caused me to think that what was the one thing that I really loved and really, in life, and it was photography at that time. So I put together a portfolio, dropped out of university, applied to art school in Detroit, and got accepted. So I started there in the fall of 1972. And like I said, I was pretty undisciplined with my photography, but I knew that that's what I wanted to do. So at the university, I honed my technical skills. We learned the zone system there. So it's like like now you might calibrate your computer screen and whatnot. Well, in those days, you calibrated how you processed your film and how you printed and so forth. That's what the zone system taught you to do. So I learned that, and more importantly, perhaps, I studied the history of photography because I wasn't very aware of that, and that really kind of focused me. And as to, you know, the whole history of photography. And the third thing was that I was associating with like-minded people. And I think the camaraderie of that is something that really affected me a lot too. So, but after 2 years, that's when I came to the decision that I didn't want to make my living at photography. At the school in Detroit, there was kind of like two avenues that people went down. One was commercial photography, because that school was kind of a training ground for the car photographers in Detroit. And so it was either that or academia. In other words, you would go get your degree and then go on to grad school. You can get your master's degree and perhaps teach or whatever. Well, I didn't want to do any of those, but I knew that photography was going to be something I was going to do the rest of my life. So I dropped out after 2 years, didn't get a degree, and got a job in Ann Arbor, and not related to photography, in the printing business. However, I did wind up in a dark room, because back in those days, you developed the films to make the plates in a dark room. And I actually learned how to make halftones and all that kind of stuff. But upon graduating, and leaving the school in spring of '74, two other important things happened to me. And that was, I met my wife-to-be, and we are still together. And through her, met a person that is a lifelong friend, another photographer in the Detroit area, who actually did graduate from the school that I went to prior to about the time that I started. And anyways, through him, I met several other Detroit area street photographers, and that basically we bonded on our appreciation for Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander, Dean Arbus, people like that. And there was maybe 6 of us or so. And in that time, so my most prolific time in my work was from about 1974 to the mid '80s. And mainly it was through the association of those people. I had a couple of shows in Detroit. There was a woman that was she was the director of something at the Detroit Main Library, and she was a friend to Detroit photographers, and she put on some shows. And I had a one-person show there, and there was a couple of group shows. But frankly, not very many people saw that work that we were doing back then, except, it was just a small cell of people. And actually, it was kind of like, we kind of enjoyed it, because back in those days, you could go around. The access to things was, I think, from my experience there and my experience now, access was a lot easier back then. And there wasn't you didn't encounter the negativity that I sometimes encounter these days. And, nobody knew what we were really doing. We went to a lot of events, photographed at various public events, and we felt very free to do whatever we want, shoot whatever we want. We felt like, kind of like aliens from another world coming to observe these strange people. And within ourselves, we shared each other's works and showed each other's work, and what we tried to do is basically one up one another on how crazy of an image that we could come up with in the public domain. So that period was very much fun. And I hope that, feel free to ask me questions about stuff like that too in the question and answer period. But then from about in the '90s into the early aughts was kind of a little bit of a waning period in my relationship to photography. We were raising 2 teenage daughters, and I had just a lot of stress at the work I was doing, and I kind of didn't choose, to be honest with you. And then until about 2003, 2004 or so, we moved to a different house, and I came to the conclusion that I didn't want to build another darkroom. I had built 5 up to that point over the preceding 35, 40 years. But I decided I didn't want to do that anymore. And I actually sold all my darkroom stuff and my film cameras. I had a Leica M2 and a Fuji 6x9 camera. Sold them in about 2005, and then bought a inexpensive well, it wasn't really inexpensive, relatively inexpensive at that time, digital Canon. And because I'd always wanted to work in color. And so I started doing that and kind of got reinvigorated. And in 2008, I lost my job in the Great Recession. And so I was on unemployment and did a couple odd jobs here and there, but had some time on my hand. And in the up until that, a few years prior to that, I had started to get involved in looking at a lot of online blogs, photography blogs. And I discovered Flickr in 2009 and joined Flickr and started posting my stuff. And then a little bit later that year, I got a scanner, and a little flatbed scanner, and started scanning my negatives from the 70s and early 80s and posting those on Flickr, and they began to get some interest. Like I say, nobody really had seen them until that point. Not any kind of a large amount of people had seen them at that point. And they started getting a lot of interest. And in late 2010, a young couple, independent publishers from France, emailed me, and they showed me a picture of little 4x5 snapshots of all of my archive stuff that I had posted, and said, "How would you like to do a book?" So we did, and it was a very shoestring operation. They were independent publishers. I did the scans on my flatbed scanner for the book. And the book came out towards the end of 2012. We went 2 years, kind of went back and forth, and for a while I didn't hear from them. Then all of a sudden they'd send me an edit that they did, and we'd go back and forth, and I gave my ideas about what I thought were strong of those images, what weren't and what worked. So anyways, in 2012, the book came out, and I started getting a little more people saw my work, and basically the old stuff. And an interesting thing that Michelle was talking about, building an archive and shooting it almost as if to record what was going on at that time for somebody 30 years in the future. And that's kind of how it turned out for me. In the work that I was doing in the 70s and early 80s that seemed to garner a lot of attention. As a matter of fact, especially in France, at least initially, because in 2014 I went over to France with Burn My Eye. We got a group show over there during the photo week in November, and it was kind of amazing to me how many people, younger photographers, French photographers, that were interested and knew about my stuff. So anyway, since then, and I've had another book published through the Peanut Portfolio editions that are a slim hardcover with an accompanying limited edition print. So that's out there too. I continue to shoot, and now what I'm working on these days is one project, is another long-term project that on shooting parade watchers in small northern Michigan towns. And I started this in about 2012. And each year, I really only shoot about 4 or 5 different parades because it's on Memorial Weekend, 4th of July, and there's some other small town, community type events and parades that they have, every year. So I'm building those into a body of work, and it's kind of fascinating to me, maybe almost similar to what Michelle is doing too, in that she's attracted to here's a much more close up, the artifacts and so forth, and looks and accoutrement of people in contemporary life. And the people up in small town Michigan that come out to these parades, that with their finest, meaning that, a lot of the clothing, the image t-shirts and whatnot that they wear that kind of advertise their beings, I guess is what it seems like to me. So, that's what I've been doing. And plus I've been doing a lot of it, and always have done this too, is shooting the cultural landscape, stuff that I come across that seems to be indicative of the culture that we're in right now, the American culture. Unfortunately, I haven't done as much of that since the pandemic's been, raging. Because a lot of that was through travel, and I haven't been doing, the last 2 years, I haven't been doing too much travel. But that's about where I'm at right now. So,
Yeah, I have a question for you.
yeah, sure.
It's really interesting because both you and Michelle are really kind of documenting culture, but your approaches are very different. Like with Michelle, she's getting in really close and, emphasizing certain details. But when you look at those details, not only visually what you're taking in, but you have a sense of the moment, the time.
Mm-hmm.
So like 20 years, you'll be able to look at those pictures and you'll be able to say, okay, this was a turn of the century. When I take a look at your images, you're doing a much more wider, more expansive view, right? You're including people in there, but the space, the moment is all happening there. And it's providing just as much sort of context and feel for a place.
Mm-hmm.
So did that way of seeing, do you attribute it more to sort of just your natural way of looking, or was that something that was honed as a result of the community of photographers that you were part of?
Well, back in the 70s and so forth, I mean, I was attracted to the energy of, like I said, I photographed a lot of events. I was frankly, I was a weekend warrior because I did have a day job. And so when I wanted to shoot, I wanted to go for places where there was a lot of social energy. So, and that's kind of what I responded to it. And I, to this day, I like it. I don't have the, maybe the physical stamina to do that kind of stuff all day, but I do. And one reason I like stuff like parades is that it is a defined sense of time, and in that the parade, lasts, maybe it's an hour or whatever, but I also photograph the beginning and the end too. But it takes, things are happening quickly, and I enjoy, kind of responding to that energy, the social energy. And I think this notion of like the cultural aspects too, because of how things transpired for me, in that a lot of the stuff from the 70s and early 80s didn't really become, people didn't really respond to it until 30, 40 years later.
Yeah. Which
now kind of like that's why what I shoot now with the notion of, well, what's this going to look like in 30 or 40 years? I mean, I might not be around, but I think the experience that I've had with my earlier stuff causes me to kind of approach the contemporary stuff that way too.
Yeah, that's great. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, John. All right. Janet. Take it away.
Honored to be included in this group. I haven't personally thought about myself so much as a street photographer. So it's interesting to listen in to the conversation from the point of view of serious practitioners. Well, I have come to it somewhat from perhaps another perspective. And yet everything everybody said, I'm like, oh yeah, no, that's all true. I thought that on my own. So there is a kind of a flow, a consistency, an approach that is associated with this style of work. Why don't I go ahead and start? Okay, so does that look right? That's me, Janet Delaney. I make sure we had that organized. I have my approach is really project-based in general. I've done a couple of long extended projects on different different communities that I've been very much involved with, but it seemed that there was this parallel body of work that I had been creating over the years, and has in much the same way for Dawn been resurrected. So I'm going to tell you about two projects that I've just finished publishing, and then I'm going to show you some other things that sort of fit into the street photography genre. I spent a lot of time photographing in San Francisco in the South of Market District, which is its own story, and I'm not going to address that. It's pretty well represented on my website if you want to know more about it. But I left the South of Market and I moved to the Mission District, which is a very distinctly different environment. While I was living there, I started picking up my Rolleiflex as opposed to my view camera because it was kind of a more relaxing way to approach photographing. I wasn't with the same sense of intention of creating a whole body of work around a particular topic of gentrification, which is what I'd been doing before. I was just responding to my community, which, you know, I paid close attention to. The light on the street, the activities of what was going on around me were very different than where I had been, which was a warehouse district. And so it was engaging in a way that I hadn't been able to experience in my earlier work. So I got to know my neighbors. I dropped in on their parties, and, you know, it was always a little bit awkward because, you know, you're sort of, it's unexpected to see people outside of, you know, just breaking through those walls that we have culturally and just working your way slowly into other people's lives, which is what the camera really allows you to do. But whenever there was an event, I'd always make sure I showed up, and I would look at not only the event itself, but also the people who were experiencing it. Whenever there was a fair in the area, as soon as the tilt-a-whirls were set up, and I would slip in next to the parents with their children and the kind of wary teenagers. And, you know, I didn't have a child with me. I just had my camera. So it was slightly awkward, but somehow I was able to create a kind of a invisible shield, I would like to think, as I sort of moved around these crowded spaces. Whenever I saw a poster on the street for an upcoming demonstration, I was sure to show up. There were a lot of them in the 80s in San Francisco, marching down Market Street, and there were parades and Mardi Gras style events in the Mission. So there was plenty to zero in on. There was a farmers market that had gotten established in 1981. It was called Heart of the City Farmers Market. And I would show up there regularly on Sundays, because really there were not a lot of times when there were sufficient in numbers of people to really do street photography. You had to have, I felt, a kind of a crowd, and those crowds came, you know, when events happened, which I think people, you know, in New York City, however, there's always a crowd. And so whenever the opportunity came to go to New York City, I would seize the moment. I had a friend who worked as he would arrange courier services. And so he would call me up, and I was working in a dark room at the time. And he'd say, I have a free ticket to New York if you can come tonight at midnight. And so I'd take those red eye flights and I'd just get myself over to the other side of the country, where it was a much more complicated environment to photograph. There was so much more going on. I didn't have to wait for an event. It was just a day-to-day experience. And I just reveled in these sort of, moments of public intimacy with people I didn't know, where I know a lot of what Michelle was talking about. It's a kind of a rush to be in those kinds of engage in brief engagements with people. Using the Rolleiflex is a very quiet camera. It was out of date even in 1980s when I was using it. I was using 1960s version, twin lens reflex, and they're not necessarily the easiest thing to think about shooting. It's kind of backwards. When you go one way, the camera, the images are, but I've been using a view camera, so upside down and backwards was not a problem. But I basically made all these photographs in the Mission District and in New York City between about 1982 and 87. And I just made contact sheets, made a handful of prints and put them away. So this is getting to what Dawn had to say. I didn't think about them. I got busy doing a lot of other projects. I had received a couple of NEA grants, and I was in Nicaragua photographing, and I was also teaching and raising children. And so it wasn't until a lot of those responsibilities were, I was relieved of the child rearing and other major parts of my life. And I had the chance to do a book about South of Market called South of Market with Mac Books in London. And he came back through San Francisco in 2017, and I showed him a box of prints that I'd made from those negatives and those contact sheets I just showed you. And he said, yeah, let's make 2 books. I didn't know what they were going to be about, but I realized it was an opportunity for me to breathe life back into these projects and to really try to see that work from a contemporary point of view. I started with Public Matters because it was the Trump era, and I felt really strongly that I wanted to shine a light on the immigrant community I had been living in and the idea of public life and public protest, because there was so much of that happening at that moment. And I could also feel, because of the imprint of technology on San Francisco, which is so massive, and you could see it in all the big cities, that where people were sort of shrinking away from the unexpected activities. I just wanted to celebrate the street as an important part of our social fabric. So I knew I wanted a big crowd, and I used that as my cover. It's a wraparound cover of this one crowd scene. And the book is a horizontal shape. It's 9.5 by 11 with a jacket that is that picture of the crowd on a paperback. So it's got a very kind of informal quality to it. It's very soft and kind of approachable. And but I knew I wanted to make it a public kind of an event. So I started off this first images with a poet, and it's like the announcing of what's about to come. And I wove together, I think, for me, in talking about my street photography, it is about a story that I'm working on to try to use these images in sequences and editing out certain images and leaving others in to create a narrative about a particular moment in time. So by, juxtaposing images, I could create some kind of a conversation. And so I'm going to give you just a few samples from the book that address those kinds of issues that happen from the sequencing part of it. So, for example, this idea of gender representation, how this woman is showing us her best self here. And then let's see if we could, going from here to, this super feminine representation. So these 2 pictures would be seen as on facing pages in the book. And then these 2 pictures follow, and you have these two bathing beauties and these teenagers that are representing themselves in very different ways, and just thinking about what our public street life is. And then these two Girl Scouts at a Peace, Jobs, and Justice event make a nice segue into another part of the conversation. They have a sign that says cookies, not Contras, which would be a direct relationship to the war in civil war in Nicaragua that was won by the Sandinistas, and then the opposition party of the Contras, sponsored by the United States, was trying to overthrow that revolution. And so this idea of all these mixed messages happening in one photograph, I found quite compelling. But you would have to sort of understand the social implications of these things and be able to read the cultural history. So I juxtaposed that with this image of these Latinx students in the ROTC, and a kind of nervous picture of a crowd of people from that neighborhood, just to kind of see about creating a kind of a tension by the juxtaposition. This is the first Martin Luther King Day parade that happened in 1986 after, an immense struggle to get this acknowledgement. It's a long and difficult history, but finally it happened. And so just showing up to all of these events, named that moment in time. The 70s, back to the land, organic food, farmers markets, starts in the heart of the city farmers market. And I juxtaposed it with a very sedate, old school Kitty's restaurant, Pioneer Fish Poultry Store, just to show how the city's culture was in flux. There's a kind of a mesmerizing quality of shopping for sparkling things, and looking at this kind of public idea of being out in the world shopping, and as opposed to hiding online and getting boxes thrown at our door. So I had a contemporary point of view kind of as I mined these older images of, young men happily drinking on a Saturday versus tending to the children with a pipe and a payphone. So this project was published in 2018. They sort of finish up the book with these images of kind of referencing the demographics of San Francisco, which, was getting more and more white and less diverse as the economics of the city have been so radically transformed by the arrival of the tech industries. I had an exhibition, and I was able to get people in the community who's I had photographed, almost 30 years before, to show up by doing kind of some serious footwork with outreach. And that was a wonderful moment to bring everybody back together again. And the gallery was actually located right in the Mission District. So I finished that book, and I went on to the second book, also by Mac, which was about the photographs I'd made during those journeys that I'd taken to New York City during 1984, 85, 86, and 87. And this was just a smaller book. It's almost square. It's got a cloth cover on it, and it's got gold embossed lettering. So it has a kind of precious quality. The cover was a pretty easy thing to come up with about the idea of an artist painting a city, thinking about a personal perspective. But the Red-Eyed in New York, it took me a while to get comfortable and to find a name, but that name was so important because that name really situates me as an outsider, which I really am in this context. And so often when we think about New York City, the photographs are made by people who live there, and rightly so. It's an incredibly complicated place. But in order to bring these pictures into a context that was sort of understandable, I wanted to foreground the fact that these were sort of brief moments in time that I captured as I wandered through the streets of New York. And again, the first photograph is always really important, like the first sentence in a book, it sets a style or a taste of what you're going to get. And so this was one of those, happenstances of a double exposure, which my Rolly would do from time to time. old worn out camera. But I just wanted to name how chaotic it was and to show that kind of energy that was going to come. But I also found very quiet streets in this moment in time. The project I'd been working on in South of Market really was looking at the older buildings and how the newer buildings were coming up. So this picture on the, I guess the right, really highlights that idea. It's so perfectly. This is down at the South Street Seaport area, but when I was going there, it was called the Fulton Fish Market. And then the Twin Towers in this sort of lonely picture on the opposite page. And this juxtaposition of the person painting the idealized view versus what was really what New York looked like in the 80s, which was, you know, it was just coming out of a major recession and the place was very maligned. So the juxtapositions create narratives that I think are so important to putting even more kind of a larger picture to the story.
Janet, you mentioned that, you know, the relationship between the images. And I think that an important development in any photographer's, especially a street photographer, is moving beyond the singular image to the point where you're juxtaposing two images. You're looking at putting together sort of a body of work. For you, did that come about as a result of producing the books, or had you come to that sort of awareness previously?
Well, I understood photography in that way, and I just hadn't gotten to these pictures yet. And so, but when I was making the images, I wasn't thinking about that per se. These images were made very much as an act of love, moving to a place in time. And I didn't have a particular agenda like I had for the South of Market work or the Nicaraguan work, or, you know, a couple other projects that I would have ongoing relationships with. These were all done really just in a much more organic way. But I was, I think, ready to create this, you know, after years of working in the medium and have a more nuanced and complicated relationship with them. Where are we? There's this one sequence that I made on the Staten Island ferry. When I went to New York, I would arrive at like 4:30 in the morning. That's why it's called a red eye, because you're absolutely exhausted, and just kind of stumble out and wander around. I had a friend who lived on Water Street down by Fulton Fish Market. So I would go up to her loft and I would stay with her, and I would be there for a few days, or then I'd go home and I'd come again, you know, maybe not until the next year or what have you, for whatever reasons I could navigate that trip. But on one of my trips, I was there with a group of other photographers. I was assisting in a workshop with Magnum, and I was in this taxi being dropped off at my friend's loft, and I said goodbye. It was like 3:30 in the morning. It was New York. It was a warm summer night, and I realized I didn't have the key to get into the loft. And it was 5 flights up, and I couldn't even yell to get my friend to wake up. So I realized I was going to be on my own for the night. And I photographed because I had my camera, and I made a lot of underexposed, out of focus pictures for a while, but I ended up on the Staten Island ferry at 6 a.m. and just followed the handful of people that were taking the first ride of the day. Sorry, I'm not alone. There we go. but I'd been photographing protests in San Francisco. So running across a strike or seeing these posters about Ronald Reagan, who was being targeted for having not responded to the AIDS epidemic, were fitting to my language that I would normally just be gravitating towards. And so when I put the book together, they found, company amongst each other, or just this, the physicality of city life was fascinating to me. I grew up in LA. I grew up in a car. I hardly ever talked to strangers. You just looked at things through the window. And so this intimacy of being on the street, I think was very compelling. So, as Michelle, go ahead, please.
Kevin had a question for you. He says, he mentions that he was born and raised south of Market Street, and it's a very different world than it was. But he wonders, for anyone with a camera down there, must have been hard. How did you navigate the area with the camera and still capture such fluid moments without any danger?
Who said there wasn't any danger? Yeah. I think it's a reasonable question, and I did struggle with it quite a bit because when I first started, I was held up at knife point and I lost all my gear. And it was really the impetus to try to figure out where I was living in a more in-depth way. And so I came back to my apartment, sort of somewhat shaken up, and over the next few months, introduced myself to all my neighbors, started making appointments with people literally on the street when I would see them. And then I would go into their homes and photograph them and do interviews with them. And the subtext, the motivation was that I want to know who I can trust, who's on the street. I was, living with a roommate. It was just the two of us, two young women. My roommate was a filmmaker. I was just in graduate school, and it wasn't so much that it was a super dangerous neighborhood as there weren't a lot of people, and when you get that kind of feeling, if something goes wrong, there's no one there to really witness what's happening. And so I wanted to reach out and connect with everybody that I could. And that was sort of a key part of the South Market work, was that I got inside to places and talked to people. But I also did it with a view camera, and that made it so that I had a lot of presence when I was on the street. And it was sort of like I was working, they were working. It was definitely light industrial work was still happening. And I'd wander into the print shops and the like, and to the various other, auto shops and whatever, businesses or restaurants, cafes that I could find my way into. And so it was kind of an inside out kind of effort. Does that answer the question, do you think?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, good. All right, so I didn't talk about South of Market, and I know that's what I'm usually best known for, but when I looked at my two South of Market projects, I do have street photos that are integrated into the more formal pictures that I have organized and made appointments to make and what have you. But I thought, well, I would just try to stay on topic for this one. And because actually I love street photography, and I think that it's such an important skill, because it's like you're doing these improvisations, you're having to use all the most complicated things about photography in very quick and decisive ways, like composition, lighting, and social interaction. The three key elements for street photography, and you practice it and you do get better. I thought, what Michelle said is so right on about that. And the more you do it, it becomes a lot more seamless. So I was listening to another person speak about it the other day, who I think is an editor at the New York Times, and he was saying that he always tells students that even if you don't consider yourself a street photographer, if you're busy working as a editor, as a, you know, doing, for example, staged work or what have you, studio work, that practicing street photography is a foundational approach to the medium and really getting those skills up. So I find that this last section that I'm going to show you are photographs that I've made over the last 20 years, or well, probably 15 years, when I've been out on the street with not a particular agenda or a particular assignment, so to speak, that I might have given myself. And I titled this "Why Photograph Strangers?" because, well, one of my students asked me that question, and I was so taken aback by it, because it was a kind of a profound moment in why do we do this? You know, what is it that compels us to do this? I taught photography at UC Berkeley for many years. And so having to actually articulate this was, I thought, an amazing challenge. And I think that I basically am so taken by the complexity of humanity in public that I just want to consume it all in a way, just to have it and be able to hold it and to think about it. And all these photographs I have of people, they're gone. It was a split second. It'll never happen again. But they've been sort of, you know, held still for all of us. And we've talked about the historical nature of what we're doing, you know, and you can really see it in when you look at Dawn's work and my work, and you kind of chuckle at like, oh, wow, I can't believe they used to do that kind of a thing, phone booths or what have you. But it's got to be more than that. You know, it's got to be a kind of a syntax that you create of, you know, multiple things happening at once and layering up of things. So the last one was Paris. This one is New Delhi.
And someone is asking, are these all again with the Rolly?
Everything, yes. It's Athens.
You've been using the same Rolly all this time?
I finally wore one out and had to buy another one. I wore just too many double exposures.
And people, feel free to put questions in the chat. As soon as you're done, I'll ask some of the questions that have been posted to each of the photographers. So if you have any questions for any or all, please put them in the chat.
This is in a beauty shop in Cape Town. And, you know, it's like, I think just walking by and seeing something and then going back and just walking in and asking if you can make a photograph. You know, sometimes I'm so on and I can so do it. And other times I just can't even fathom how that I could break through that place that we create for ourselves in that private space on public life. And but I think when I'm in another place that I know I won't be back again, you know, when I'm traveling, there's a kind of mandate, there's an urgency to it that might give me more courage, perhaps. This is in Beijing. there's that kind of meditative quality of taking that next step of making a photograph in a very intentional way, that is kind of a rush. It's like it's a high to just suddenly focus so closely in on something. And they're brief moments. Maybe I took 2 pictures of this person. This is on the subway in New York. London. Back in Delhi. Istanbul.
Someone's asking whether you use a negative or positive film.
It's all shot on Portra 400. Negative. Madrid. So there you have it.
Great work. Thank you so much, Janet.
You're welcome.
All right. We have a couple of questions in the queue. Let's see. Michelle, this is from another one from Kevin. This is Michelle, you have always done your own thing and stayed true to your vision, and now you shoot a lot of editorial work. And happily, it seems as if you continue to shoot your own raw street style. How have you found this transition? Do you find that you're able to continue to shoot how you see, or do you need to make compromises because of the monetary exchange and having editors overseeing your shoot?
Yeah, it's a give and take for sure. I have, on one hand, I'm hired because of my style. So like I get jobs that are specific to what I shoot. People don't generally choose me for things that aren't like applicable to how I see. But at the same time, my personal work is too close for editorial. And, I'm there to illustrate a story generally, and to help a writer get across certain ideas, etc. So I always have to, be much more considered. And it took me a minute to shift in my mind, but I have to pull back. So when I shoot editorially, the compromise is I'm giving much more information, story, much more straight narrative than if I was only, but not always. Sometimes I'm like hired to do a portrait and then I can go buck wild and do my thing. But even still, like I'm so close in my personal work that doesn't necessarily translate to a larger audience or an illustration unless it does. So I'll mix it up. I'll do a little bit of both. That's been a real compromise, but in a way, I think that I'm starting to come to terms with like finding a balance. So like I'm a little bit rawer with my editorial than I was, say, a year ago, and a little bit more comfortable bringing that kind of like more artistic energy over to storytelling. And then also I've been going around and telling more stories in the street. So I'll like follow somebody for a few frames and like give you more of a, whether it's a physical breakdown of somebody, or I'll follow them for a bit and tell you a little bit more about them. And that comes from having done so much editorial. And also, I think it's kind of interesting, and I'm sure this relates to just about everybody here, is that like public photography in general took a real hit over the last few years. Like I didn't personally feel comfortable photographing as close to people or being out in public as much. And there was a real animosity towards me, more so than general, as far as like, you know, what that was like. So I spent the bulk of my last 2 years just like consistently shooting editorial and commercial work. And I put a lot of my street photography on hold. I would do it here and there, but nothing like I was doing it before. So for sure, I'm still kind of navigating like, how did all that work affect my street photography? How is it affecting me now? Am I more afraid? Am I bringing larger ideas to the table? Hopefully it's positive. We'll see. Yeah, it's definitely a different way of thinking.
Don, for you, you had a sort of an interesting experience in terms of revisiting your work, in the fact that, you know, these people from across the pond basically did an edit of your work. And I'm wondering how that process, especially when you started collaborating with the book, what did you learn about your own photography that you didn't realize until you were in the process of, you know, working with these people to put it all together?
That's a good question. What did I learn? Well, I guess one thing I learned is that the work I was doing, that not very many people saw back in the time, resonated, and I mean, obviously I enjoyed that. And I guess, you know, to be honest with you though, I don't know even to this day how much that interest is some kind of a nostalgia that some observers might have for a certain period of time. You know, it's difficult to judge your own work, I think, and it's difficult also to people's reactions. You know, what are they responding to? Hopefully they are responding to this intelligent work. You know, it is, you know, but you know, there's obviously, you know, you spend any time on social media, and a lot of even people now, they're making contemporary photographs. They want to photograph old stuff, and it gets a lot of interest and everything. So it's the whole notion of popularity and that regarding that is tough to decipher.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that nostalgia plays a role, but I think that there's evident strength in all the work that we're seeing tonight, especially in terms of composition. Even though you describe yourself as an amateur, some of the things that you're doing in the frame are really sophisticated. So, and I think that it does a disservice to anyone's work if they simply attribute it to nostalgia, because to be able to hold your attention, you still need a good eye and have a really clear understanding of how the camera changes what's in front of the photographer. Here's a question that anybody can answer. There's the question of, have phones, iPhones, digital phones, camera phones, changed street photography for good?
I'll take that because I've given it a lot of thought. there are two things. There's one small positive thing, and that is that people are sort of oblivious to the phone. They don't experience it that much. It's just sort of, it's like a background thing. So if you're making street pictures with your phone, you're probably a lot less disruptive to the flow of life. It's as if, it's seamless in its own way. But what the frustrating thing for me is that people aren't present. If you're on your phone and you're out in public, you don't know what else is going on around you. It's like you've just left the scene. You've been zoomed into some other space altogether. You know how you stop in the middle of the road to check the directions and everybody else has to walk around you, because for those moments, you're just buried in your phone on the map, right? Or it could be an incoming text message, or suddenly something's caught your attention on your phone and you're mentally gone. And so there's not any energy to sort of pick up on as a photographer about that moment, or as another person on the street that might want to interact with you, because you're not there. And that is sad in my mind, because it means you're not part of, you're not at the party and you're just taking up space.
One of the things that kind of bothers me about cell phones that I've come to realize just recently that I'm kind of bothered by is the notion, I think especially with the Apple phones, the artificial intelligence that is involved in making these. They look great in one sense, but it's kind of like the phone telling you how it should look. And there's an aspect of that bothers me.
I guess I'll chime in. I've always been an early adopter of new technology. And if somebody wants to make a cell phone good enough, that will look better than it does and enable me to use Flash with it. I'll do it. Who cares? I mean, and I find that I agree, it's so annoying to have everybody on their phone all the time. It's really depressing because I'm kind of in between ages. And I think that I just try and make it part of the work then. I'm if you're gonna, that's part of it. We can ignore it and we can hide from it, or we can hate on it. But it's out there and these kids are using them in ways that we won't even maybe understand one day. So I'm just trying to run with it and embrace it and see what it can offer me, because it's just one more tool. I'm big on tools. I don't think they lead to much, or they're just things. It's not the essence of anything. I actually personally, I hate when people are what camera do you use? But if somebody wants to make a cell phone camera that I can keep in my pocket and I don't have to carry around the whole thing, do it, please. I'll buy it. I don't know. I mean, yeah.
All right. And to wrap things up, I have a question just for everybody. What would be a suggestion, a tip that you would offer to anyone who's, interested in street photography or already practicing, that has nothing to do with equipment?
I would say learn the history, become familiar with the tribal language.
Okay. And Janet?
I think you have to ask yourself why you're doing it. What draws you to it, and what are your intentions with it? I think I sort of respond. I don't really enjoy street photography that has that quality of I gotcha, and somebody looks just awful and they look compromised and they seem sort of like they put their finger in a socket and you were there and you captured this totally devastating moment at their expense, right? And so, that is obviously something people are thrilled to find in their images sometimes, but I would say I would sort of, not engage in that kind of imagery or that kind of image making. So I guess, just understanding what you're going for. So I'm just using that as like saying that isn't what I'm going for. I know I'm going for something else. So just to be clear about or work towards it, and you won't get there unless you just go out and photograph. The photographs will inform how you know, they will tell you what you do. I don't know. There's a lot of people that I would also say maybe stop. I'm going to just counter what Dawn said and say, don't look at anyone else's work because it seeps in. And then you start making their pictures. And that's not very interesting, you know, so you want to get your own language, which you get best when you know why you're doing it.
Yeah, I like all that stuff too. Yeah. Be kind and gentle and recognize that just because you're behind something that you're still part of the world, and know what you want to say. Yeah. And those photos of catching people are so boring. Don't be boring, and don't listen to any rules. Make up your own rules and get to know yourself and be crazy and like do whatever you want. The more you do that, and also don't look at people's work. I'm so all about that. Yes. Yeah,
And
that's like,
my suggestion would be throw yourself into life. Don't
Yeah.
go out.
have
Don't go out.
fun.
Go out and have fun, and just so happen to be making pictures. You know, there's so much to experience out there, and I think the better pictures come from you living and enjoying the experience you're in the middle of, and then making pictures. The pictures can only get better.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
with
the act of photographing makes me feel so present. So, you know,
Yeah.
in all those places that I showed you in that last group of slides, which I actually had never showed anybody. So I was a little like, oh, well, I'll just do this today, right? Highly new moment. Every one of them is just like they're like a little, I don't know, they're like a little gift that I have of that happened and that I got to bring home. I mean, some people get souvenirs. I bring home these images.
I'm really honored to have the chance to meet you, see your work, learn about it, and for sharing the stage with you for a while. So thank you so much for including me.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
turn it over to Kevin and Brandon.
I want to thank our presenters again, and I want to thank Ibarionex for doing an outstanding job as our moderator. And I want to thank all you folks for attending tonight. I really appreciate your time as well. Hope you enjoyed. We'll see you next time.